Welcome everybody to our 83rd Reading Online Sport Economics Seminar. I'm really pleased that Jed has just put up his screen so I can see what his title is. I have to go and check what his title is. We've got Jed Armstrong from New York University presenting Talking Baseball, Peer Effects in Decision Making. Before he gets going, a few things just to mention. The first is that as with last week, Jed's quite happy to take questions as he goes along. So please feel able to raise your hand at any point and interrupt Jed with questions. We've got up to an hour and a half. We can take as much of that as we need to discuss Jed's paper. Other than that, please keep yourselves on mute while Jed is talking. There's no need for me to take up any more time that Jed could be presenting in. So Jed, please take away your talk. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate the sort of opportunity to present here at the seminar series. And like James said, yeah, please feel free to butt in with any questions, and I'm really happy to take any feedback, advice, suggestions, anything at the end. This paper or this project is sort of going to form part of my doctoral thesis at NYU, so yeah, all and any advice is really appreciated. What I'm doing in this project is I'm looking at peer effects. I'm sure with a lot of sort of microeconomists in the group, I don't necessarily need to motivate why we're interested in peer effects, but I'm going to have a little go at motivating why I do what I do in this project. So obviously, economists are in general interested in group spillovers and network effects. This is sort of a long literature. A lot of people have written lots of great papers, have made storied careers, thinking about what happens when you take a highly productive person and you sort of interact them with a low productivity group or vice versa. But I think as well as sort of thinking about those productivity spillovers, there are a bunch of other peer effects that maybe we're interested in as well. I've got an example here, decision making, that's what I'm sort of interested in. But you can kind of think about a lot of different aspects of life and the sort of, choices that people make. We can think about how those choices are affected by others. Of course, a big part of this literature, a big part of answering these questions about group spillovers is a data challenge. We need to observe individuals in many shuffled teams over time, ideally randomly shuffled teams. And we really need to be able to identify clearly and sort of quantify the thing that we're looking at. So we need to be able to identify individual level productivity or individual level errors or individual level decision making. This is sort of a challenge. Naturally, it's sort of quite difficult. People don't really tend to switch teams that often, and getting really detailed, granular team or individual level productivity data or decision-making data can be tough. So that's sort of why I turned to the sort of sports data type field. Basically, it's going to allow me to sort of get at this need here, which is a setting with frequent team switches, individual level errors, and some mechanism for spillovers. And that's where Talkin Baseball comes in. My setting that I'm going to look at is Major League Baseball umpires. So for those who don't necessarily follow American sports, that's sort of like the referees in the highest professional baseball level, highest professional baseball league in North America. So I'm looking at these umpires and I'm looking at their decisions in terms of their pitch call quality. And I'll provide lots of examples and sort of clarification about what I mean by this. But just to sort of give a heads up why I'm interested in this, I don't think I'm the first person to present on baseball in the Roses talks. The data are absolutely fantastic. And in particular, when I'm looking at Major League Baseball umpires, they are assigned to work in crews, so a group of 3 or 4 umpires, and they work together as a crew every season, maybe every series, maybe every game. So they're working in these randomly shuffled teams. Because of the excellent baseball data, we can identify the quality of every single decision that they make. And I'm going to have a particular type of decision that I'm interested in, which is a strike or ball call. And using network data and game data, we're able to attribute mistakes or the quality of a decision uniquely to every individual. So thinking about the setting that we need, frequent switches, individual level errors, some mechanism for spillovers, it seems like Major League Baseball umpires are an excellent sort of test bed for thinking about networks. One of the things that's sort of an advantage in terms of these Major League Baseball umpires is that even though the mistakes are uniquely attributable to an individual, Major League Baseball, in their sort of handbook for umpires, they put a really strong emphasis on these umpires working together as a team. So even though each sort of individual is kind of making their own decisions, they're really encouraged to operate as a unit, to review games together, to assist each other, and so on. So definitely there is some mechanism where maybe me, an umpire, being allocated to work with a very good umpire might sort of help me to improve my performance. So yeah, I think the setting is a fantastic one. So what I'm going to do in this paper is I'm going to construct a decision quality index. This is going to allow me to quantify how good the decisions being made by these umpires are. And I'm going to do this at a game level, and I'll denote that by a lowercase q for quality, for individual I in game G, working with crew C in season T. And sometimes I'll want to do this at a season level as well. I'll aggregate all the games up and I'll denote that by a capital Q. So that's going to be my decision quality for individual I working in crew C in season T. So I'll generate this decision quality index using really precise data. Then I'll generate networks of umpires based on crew allocation, so thinking about who the umpire works with. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to answer two questions. First of all, just at a high level, thinking about peer spillovers, I'm going to answer the question, does the quality of an umpire's network affect their decision-making quality? So this is just a first order quantification of network peer effects. And in particular, what I'm going to look at is the group to worker spillovers. So instead of thinking about the individual worker to a group, I'm going to think about what it means for a worker to be assigned with a group, how that group affects the worker. So that's going to be the sort of first order sort of results. The second order results, and the stuff that I think is a really sort of unique contribution that this data allows us to get at, is to think about how these group spillovers might happen through a combination of imprecision and bias. This is a really good advantage of the data that I have. It allows me to really, really precisely quantify how the decisions are being made. And so I can start to think about not just are decisions affected by peers, but exactly how those decisions are affected. And I have some sort of working theories here that bias maybe reflects like a heuristic or a prior belief. Precision maybe reflects effort or knowledge. And I'm going to sort of work towards a framework for thinking about how those two aspects might allow for spillover. Just as a quick sort of literature review or overview of where this fits, there's quite a strong precedence for using sports data for looking at peer effects, and also for using Major League Baseball umpire data. Partly this is just a reflection of the excellent data quality, but yeah, just to highlight some papers. There was this 2009 paper by Gyron Korft and Noto Wadigdo looking at peer effects using PGA golf partners. They didn't necessarily find that being allocated to work with to play with better golfers, improved golfers. But, you know, it's still a great paper. And then Jose, who presented last week, there's this paper looking at peer competition and the effects of sort of better chess players on their club mates. So this is definitely something that has been done before, using sports data to look at peer effects. And then in the context of Major League Baseball umpires, I'm just going to highlight 3 papers here using the same kind of data that I'm looking at, so quantifying these Major League Baseball umpires' decisions. So there's this AER paper in 2011 looking at racial or ethnic discrimination in pitch calls, so how umpires make calls differently depending on their own race and the race of the pitcher and the batter and the catcher. Brian Mills has this paper looking at monitoring tools on human capital formation and basically looking at how the data that I'm using today influence decisions. And then there's also this paper looking at the impact of working conditions on labor quality, which I think is quite cool, looking at how temperature and humidity affects these decisions. So this is just to basically say that what I'm doing, has some precedence. And just to kind of talk about some general applications before I get really into what I'm doing, even though I'm focusing on quite like a specific situation, Major League Baseball umpires, I think there are some broader applications. So umpires are making really rapid decisions. The decisions that they make are based on pitches, and a pitch thrown from the pitching mound, I'll talk a bit more about this in detail, can take less than half a second to reach them. So they're making really, really fast-paced decisions. They're high stakes. These are billion-dollar teams, billion-dollar organizations, and they're making really important decisions. And they are intensely scrutinized. So you can see after a game on Twitter, a lot of these umpires, their calls will be, really reviewed in detail. So even though it's quite a specific setting, I think that you can think of a lot of decision-making situations that have those same kind of characteristics. Traders, pilots, surgeons, basically anyone in any situation in which individuals are making these really high-stakes decisions. I think there's some overlap. So just for the non-Americans or those who don't have a particularly strong knowledge of baseball, I'm going to give a brief overview of how Major League Baseball umpiring works. I didn't really know much about Major League Baseball or the umpiring when I got into this, so this was useful background knowledge for me. But in general, I'm sure you're all sort of aware of the idea of a baseball diamond. So, the 4 bases, the batter is down here on home plate, the pitcher pitches from the circle in the middle of the diamond, and the batter hits it out into the outfield. The way that Major League Baseball umpiring works is that every game has 4 umpires, and they're each allocated to work on one of the bases, so the 4 sort of vertices of the diamond. So one's going to be on home plate, one's going to be on first base, one on second base, and one on third base. And all of the different umpires on the different bases have different responsibilities. So they have to decide whether a runner actually hit the base or not when they were running around the diamond after they've hit it. First base and third base, they have to decide whether a ball actually was hit into the outfield or whether it went below the foul line, and so on. And what I'm most interested in is the home plate umpire, who makes a very specific decision that I can quantify really precisely, and I'll talk about that in a second. But in terms of the network effect, these 4 umpires for a particular game, they make up what's called a crew, and the crew usually works a series together, or sometimes more than one series. And basically what I mean by a series, what baseball talks about a series as, is just several games in a row between 2 teams. So you might have heard of the World Series, which is the kind of championship of Major League Baseball. In general, a series just refers to a group of maybe 3 to 7 games played between 2 teams. And so we have this crew kind of working together for that series. So like I said, the particular interest that I have is in decisions being made by the home plate umpire. And the home plate umpire, they stand down here behind the catcher's box, so behind the batter, and they have to make a decision about whether a particular pitch is a strike or a ball. So just to kind of, point out what I'm sort of meaning here, again, some context. The decision of whether a particular pitch is a strike or a ball, for one thing, it's really, really important to a game. If the umpire determines that there have been 4 balls, then that means that the batter gets to walk to first base for free. That's fantastic for the batting team. Whereas if the umpire determines that there's been 3 strikes, then the batter is out, and that's really good for the pitching team. So determining whether a particular pitch is a ball or a strike is really, really important. How they do this? Well, anytime that the batter swings, it's automatically a strike. There are some sort of small details around like foul hits and that sort of thing, but in general, we'll just say if a batter swings, it's a strike. But if the batter doesn't swing, that's when the home plate umpire has to make a decision. And in particular, the decision that they make is whether the ball was hittable. And the way they do this is they think about something called a strike zone, and they determine whether the pitch passed through the strike zone. Basically, if it passes through, it's determined to be a strike, and if it passes outside of the strike zone, it's determined to be a ball. Here's what the strike zone looks like. Major League Baseball has very specific definitions. It's defined as the area above the home plate, sort of between the kneecaps and the midpoint of the torso. They have very precise definitions, but basically you can think about a pitcher throwing towards this batter. The catcher, who's here in the white uniform, is going to catch the pitch, and the home plate umpire, who's this guy in the gray slacks and the blue polo shirt, he has to watch the ball come through and determine whether it was in that strike zone, in which case it's a strike, or outside the strike zone, in which case it's a ball. So that's the decision that I'm interested in, is thinking about this home plate umpire and how he makes those decisions. So that's a little bit of sort of background knowledge. I'm going to talk a little bit about how Major League Baseball umpires are allocated to call a particular pitch, and then I'll get into the data and some of the results. So this is sort of thinking now about identification in this situation. And what I'm going to say is that in an ideal world, it would essentially be exogenous which particular umpire was calling which particular pitch, and which particular umpire was allocated to work with which particular crew. So ideally, we'd have these 2 exogenous relationships, the pitch to umpire relationship and the umpire to network relationship. And if that's the case, we can just sort of start to read off some of our pair effects by using ordinary least squares regressions. And I'm going to argue that in this particular situation, these 2 relationships are indeed exogenous. So I'm going to briefly talk about why this is the case, and I'm happy to take more questions on this if needed. So first of all, crews are assigned to games or series according to an exogenous scheduling algorithm. So the particular algorithm is kind of a play on the traveling salesman problem. It's called the traveling umpire problem. I've looked at the algorithm. It's fiendishly complicated, and it certainly doesn't allow for selection of crews to particular games. So that's good. That means that it's not the case that a particular crew is going to work a particular game who might have good or bad pitches. So the assignment of crews to games is strictly exogenous. Secondly, it might be the case that within a crew, an umpire, tends to be on home plate more frequently. That's not the case. because umpires are assigned game roles within the crew exogenously. So every game, the crew rotates clockwise around the diamond. So the umpire who was on home plate works third base next game, second base the following game, first base the following game, and then back to home plate. So there's this exogenous allocation of umpires to roles. That means that there's no selection of who the home plate umpire is, again, for a particular pitcher or something. We have very specific rules for injuries and pre-planned vacations. So allowing for, again, exogenous rules for replacement umpires. It's not the case that a rookie umpire coming up is always going to be working on home plate or anything like that, because every replacement umpire has to start that rotation within the crew on second or third base. So I think these first 3 points here give a really clear kind of argument that which umpire calls which particular pitch is an exogenous relationship. There can't be any kind of selection of umpires to pitches. And then the second exogenous relationship I need, thinking about the umpire and the network to whom they're allocated to work with. I've spoken a little bit with some people at Major League Baseball, and they say that this assignment is done essentially at random. They have some kind of crew chiefs who are the senior umpires, and then they kind of randomly allocate other umpires to work with those crew chiefs. What I can do to kind of test this, to test whether allocation of umpires to crews is as good as random with respect to ability, I can just use the data to make sure that there's no relationship. So I think with these 4 points here, I argue that the two relationships I need to be exogenous are indeed exogenous, and that means that I can just sort of start to read things off using OLS. So let me just sort of talk a little bit about the data that I use. And like I said at the start, the data that Major League Baseball makes available is absolutely fantastic. So I use some Python code to scrape all of the data that I'm going to use, and I can strongly recommend it for people who are sort of interested in digging into the data a little bit. So basically I need 2 types of data, and I get them from 2 different sources. So first of all, I need data on all the networks. So I need to be able to see which umpire worked with which crew every season. And to kind of look at that, I get umpire data from game logs. So you can get information on every single game and every single Major League Baseball season going back through time. And I'm able to identify, using these game logs, all crews of umpires who worked together. And the game logs also tell me the umpire position, so I can figure out who was on home plate and so who made every call. And then the second type of information that I need is on decisions. And for this, I obtain some pitch level data for every single Major League Baseball pitch thrown since 2008. It's this data set called Pitch FX, which basically uses ball tracking software. So the same kind of thing you might use for Hawkeye in tennis, or DRS in cricket, or VAR in football, except that it's available for every single pitch. So they can locate the pitch, the location of the ball, along every position in its pitch. And in particular, I can locate the pitch relative to the strike zone. The Pitch FX data also has the umpire's call, whether they called it a strike or a ball. So what I can do is I can assess the accuracy of every decision made by thinking about the actual position of the ball relative to the strike zone, whether it was a true strike or a true ball, and what the umpire's call was, whether they called it a strike or a ball. So I can calculate whether decisions were good or bad, and I can quantify the decisions a little bit further than that, which I'll get to in a second. So just to give an example of the data that I'm working with, here is what's called a pitch chart for a particular game between St. Louis and Milwaukee on March 28th, 2019. Gary Cederstrom, he was the umpire in charge of this game. And what this chart here shows is basically the field of view of the home plate umpire, Gary Cederstrom, when he's standing behind the catcher watching all of the pitches come through. So every red dot here is the location of a ball as it passed by the batter. And this black box here shows the location of the strike zone. So the width and position of the strike zone on the the horizontal axis here is determined by home plate. That's fixed. And then the height and vertical position, that's determined by the height and the stance of the batter, but this pitch effects data kind of does a normalization. So everything here is normalized to be a standard batter at a standard height. But you can see, you know, some of the balls were way wide, some of the balls were way high, some of them were way low, and so on. So this is basically every single pitch that Gary Cederstrom had to make a call on. So every pitch that wasn't hit, wasn't swung at, wasn't a foul, everything that he had to determine whether it was a strike or a ball. And here are the decisions that he made. So the blue dots represent pitches that Gary Cederstrom said were strikes, so inside of the strike zone. And the red dots are the pitches that Gary Cederstrom said were balls, so outside of the strike zone. And you can see Gary Cederstrom here, he did pretty well. You know, a lot of these balls that were way out, he correctly identified them as balls, and a lot of the pitches that were right through the middle, he correctly identified them as strikes. There are some sort of less good calls. He called this one out here, which was quite wide. He called that a strike. He called a couple of the ones on the inside a ball. And so what I do is I quantify each of these decisions as being correct or not. And that's what this chart here shows. So every blue dot is an incorrect call. So that's either a true strike that was called a ball or a true ball that was called a strike. And every red dot is correct. So a true strike called a strike or a true ball called a ball. So what I do is I do this for every game. I count up all of the correct calls and I divide it by the total number of calls that were required, and that's going to give me my decision quality index. So in this case, Gary Cederstrom got 134 calls correct. He had to make 149 decisions, so he gets a quality score for this particular game of 0.899. And then what I can do is I can just take the average over all of the games that Gary Cederstrom worked in the 2019 season, and that's going to give me my season level quality index. So this is how I construct the data that I'm going to be using. Just to sort of give a little insight into the analysis sample, it's a really vast data set. I have data going back to 2008, and I finish in the 2019 season because from 2020 onwards things were affected by COVID. The sample, oh sorry.
Stefan's got a question for you.
Yeah, sorry, I just want to ask quickly. I mean, you measured the success rate by whether they're balls, just what binary metric. Could you also do it by some kind of distance metric as well? So, I mean, the one that's far out to the left, that seems like egregious, and some of the other ones seem kind of fairly minor sins, right? So could you do that? Is that going to come?
Yes. Yeah, so that is something that I'm kind of working on at the moment. So my kind of base results are just based on this binary classification, like you say, a decision's good or it's bad. But that's exactly what I'm doing at the moment, is starting to think about a measure of how bad these decisions are. And in particular, exactly, thinking about some of these bad calls that were right on the edge. Maybe that's kind of fine if you think about like a fuzzy box, a fuzzy strike zone, whereas, like you say, this call out here is probably quite bad. So yeah, that's a great question, and that's where I'm hoping to get to eventually.
Also got Jose with a question as well.
So also a question about this this weight. So is it possible also, because you mentioned that it's a high stake game, but I assume that some points are probably more high stake than others. So I was wondering if it's possible to introduce this dimension, because it could be that it's a mistake when there's no, I mean, for example, in some cases, the decision may be not that bad. Okay, it's a bad decision, but still with no impact on the result of the game. And the other point, yes, no? Yeah.
So that's a very good point as well. A particular sort of aspect of thinking about this is like what's referred to as the count, which is how many balls and how many strikes there have been. So you can kind of think if it's the very first pitch that the batter faces, there are 0 balls and 0 strikes. It doesn't really matter if you call a ball or a strike. Whereas if there are 2 strikes and you call a strike, then the batter is out. So that's something that I'm sort of trying to think about how I can incorporate it into my regression results. Is thinking about exactly the pivot, how pivotal is a decision. But yeah, that's a great point as well. Thank you. Yeah, so on the analysis sample, like I say, I have over 4.4 million decisions in the sample. That comes from about 29,000 games over the seasons from 2008 to 2019. We have 133 umpires in the sample who work together in over 4,000 unique crews. So it's a large data set for quantifying this stuff. In terms of the quality score, the average quality, the average umpire gets about 88.5% of the calls correct, with a standard deviation of about 3.5 percentage points. So there's a reasonable amount of variation, which is useful for me. Just as like an indication, the very best game, no umpire has a perfect game in my data. Someone once got 131 calls correct out of 132, so pretty good. The worst game also had 132 decisions being made, and that home plate umpire only got 84 calls correct. So a bad day at the office for that particular umpire. So this is my analysis sample, and I'm going to be using this to kind of run some regressions to identify my peer effects. So the first type of regression I'm going to run through is to kind of analyze the identification argument that I made before. So I need to kind of think about whether assignment to crews is as good as random with respect to ability. And this is something that I can test in the data. And in particular, I'm going to run this regression specification here, which comes from this Gairan, Korft, and Noto-Wadigdo, the PGA golfers paper. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to regress the quality of an individual working in crew C in season T. I'm going to regress that on the average quality of the other crews that he was assigned to work with in that season. So this pi2 coefficient is just going to measure the relationship between my quality and the quality of crew that I'm assigned to work with. If it's positive, then that means there's sort of positive assorting. Good umpires are allocated to work with good crews. If it's negative, then good umpires are allocated to work with bad crews. And I want it to be 0. That would show that there's no relationship between my quality and the quality of the crew that I'm assigned to work with. That would mean that it's as good as random assignment with respect to crews. I also include season fixed effects, and this term here, this phi, is like a leave out quality, which just corrects for this mechanical bias where, say, the very best umpire by definition, he's going to work with a worse quality crew because all of the other umpires are worse than him, and the very worst umpire is by definition going to work with a better crew because all of the umpires are better than him. So in this Gairan-Korfter Nota Wadigdo paper, they include this term to correct for this bias. So in terms of the results here, I have the sort of OLS regression results here, and I'm thinking about two types of crews. I can think about, first of all, the crew that an individual is assigned to work with at the start of the season, and then sometimes these assigned crews get kind of shuffled up a little bit during the season because of injuries or vacations or so on. So I can think about not just who I was assigned to work with, but all of the umpires who I worked with in a particular season. And this work crew quality, that's this pi2 term here. So we can kind of see that there's essentially no relationship between the current crew quality, my quality and the quality of the crew that I'm assigned to work with. In particular, when we include this bias term, this bias correction term, there's absolutely no relationship. So I kind of argue that this means that there is as good as random assignment to crews with respect to quality, and that means that we can kind of start looking at how being assigned to work with a particular crew affects my decision making going forward, just using OLS regressions. And so that's going to be the main empirical approach, the main kind of regression I'm going to run. So I'm going to think about the quality of an individual's calls in a particular, working with a particular crew, working in a season T. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to regress that on the average quality of the crew that the individual worked with last season. So I'm going to see if I worked with really good people last season, does that make my call quality better in the following season? The hypothesis here is that this beta 1 should be positive. A higher quality crew in the past should raise current decision-making quality. And again, I include season fixed effects and various other effects. Here's how the results look graphically. So each dot here in this chart is one umpire season. And on the y-axis, we have the individual's call quality. So on average, this umpire here got about a little over 84% of their calls correct in a particular season. And then along the x-axis, we have the quality of the network or the crew that they worked with last season. So you can see this dude who made bad calls this season. Last season, he worked with really bad umpires. Whereas up here, the guys who sort of are making really good call quality, really good decisions, they tended to have worked with crews that made good decisions in the past. So graphically, it looks like there's a strong result. And if I kind of, run this regression, what we see is that there are sort of very strong type of results here. So the coefficient, the beta 1 coefficient is positive, as we would expect. And in terms of thinking about the size of this peer effect, working with a 1 standard deviation better network of umpires last season is going to improve the quality of calls this season by somewhere between 0.08 and 0.16 of a standard deviation. So it's not it's not a very, very large result, but it's certainly the fact that working with better people last season does seem to improve my quality going forward. So this is sort of positive signs just as like an early run through. The next regression I'm going to run is to put these results into game level results. So instead of thinking about season level, regressing my quality this season on the crew that I worked with last season, I'm going to think about each individual game. And so my left-hand side variable here is going to be the quality of individual I in game G, working with crew C in time T. And I'm going to, again, regress that on the quality of the network that I worked with last season. I'm going to include my own quality last season, just as kind of a control to think about. Some umpires are maybe just very good and others are maybe bad. So I'm going to include my lagged quality to kind of improve, to check that. And I'm also going to include an experience term here. This XIT is going to be the number of years experience that the umpire has in the major leagues. So some of these umpires work in minor leagues before they become promoted to Major League Baseball umpires. So this X is just going to be how many years experience in the major leagues do they have. Yes.
Again, Jose's got a question.
Sure.
Yes. So I think I have a question related to what you just said. So I was thinking about attrition. So how should I think about it? So if, for example, I'm an umpire and I made some mistakes last year, is my contract renewed, or is the sample ending up with only good umpires?
That's a very good question. And my sort of understanding, again, kind of this is based more on anecdotal stuff rather than anything in particular that I can analyze. So my understanding is that Major League Baseball umpires very, very rarely quit until they sort of get to retirement age. They're never fired for bad quality. They very, very rarely quit. And so my understanding is that attrition isn't a particularly sort of strong effect that I need to take into consideration. But one thing that I do need to take into consideration is that it seems like on average, umpires are just getting better over time. Partly that could be because of the availability of this data. Maybe they're able to go back and review calls and so on. So I sort of do some stuff with including season fixed effects to try and take that out. I've done some stuff demeaning by season, which might get to the attrition question as well. But that's a very good point.
You may also check like a prob it or a log it on the quitting, on the quality of the decision they made the year before, for example.
That's a very good call. I'll have a look at that.
Alex has got a question now as well.
I have a question. Maybe I missed it. How did you calculate the standard errors here?
So the standard errors here, I am clustering at the umpire level. So thinking that maybe the umpires sort of have a tendency to kind of make similar decisions, I'm doing that clustering.
Before you carry on, Jorge also has a question.
Sure.
Hi. Are you including crew fix effects? Because I would believe it kind of matters during the last season, because what you just said, that they never quit and it's people that know each other very well. You might have a tendency to feel better with some particular crew than with others. So I don't know, maybe, or I think maybe crew fix effects can capture that.
Yeah, so I haven't tried crew fixed effects, but I will. Yeah, I'll look into that. That's a good idea. I think I agree that it could be that maybe just some crews are very good. So I'll look into that. I include season fixed effects, and I've also done some controls with umpire fixed effects. So I either include umpire fixed effects or lagged own quality in order to kind of control for the fact that some umpires are maybe just better than other umpires, but thinking about how that might synergize into a crew fixed effect. That's a very good idea. I'll look into that. Thank you. Yeah, so in this regression here, I'm doing the game level, and yeah, so I think a key kind of interest here is including this experience term, this XIT, and then I'm also going to include an interaction term between the crew quality of the people that I worked with and experience. So this phi2 term here is going to tell us how does the peer effect depend on experience. So in terms of my hypotheses, this pi1 should be positive. Again, conditional on own quality. Working with a higher quality crew in the past should raise my core quality. But I think this phi2 term here, it's maybe ambiguous ex ante. So it could be the case that maybe more experienced umpires can learn more from their peers, or maybe it's the case that more experienced umpires kind of get bogged down in their own ways and learn less from their peers. So it's an empirical question. So I run the regression,
you move on.
and here are the results. Yeah, sorry.
Rob's got a question. You might be on mute, Rob.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, I'm not sure if this is the right place to put this, but is one mechanism by which call quality affected through the players? So if the umpire is known to call balls which ought to be strikes, won't the player adjust to that and be more likely to leave the ball alone because it's going to most likely be a ball? So isn't there a channel here through the players rather than peer effects?
Yes, so that's definitely something that I need to kind of think about. Exactly. I think that it's very true that the players are likely to try and sort of game the umpires, and there are some particular ways within baseball that this can be done. In particular, like the catcher, so the equivalent of the wicket keeper, like where he catches the ball relative to the strike zone is something that it can have a lot of influence over the umpire's decisions. Like you say, batters might be less likely to swing, pitchers might sort of position their pitches relative to the strike zone, and so on. I think that so the way I'm sort of trying to think about that is aggregating over games or over seasons where enough of this kind of like individual level, I guess, heterogeneity might kind of average out. Yeah, again, I think that it would be, I'd have to think more about this, but I think that that's only really an issue if there's like an interaction between the player, the umpire, and the crew that the umpire works with, as opposed to just the player and the umpire. But I might need to think more about that. It's a very good point.
Okay, and Alex also has a question. You're on mute, Alex.
Yeah. So sorry. So it's just a follow-up question because there is this study that shows that the umpires are biased in favor of star players. So they might make more mistakes in favor of superstars, right?
Yes, yeah.
So
yeah.
In that regard, I don't know whether there is a random allocation of superstars among umpires, but
again, I think that again, as long as the allocation of a particular umpire to be calling a particular pitch, maybe with a particular batter, as long as that's exogenous, I don't think it's particularly problematic. But I'll have to think hard about this relationship between the umpires and the players. So essentially, I think the way that the umpires are allocated to games, and then the way that the umpire within the crew is allocated to work on home plate for a particular game, I think that those two relationships being exogenous would mean that it's essentially random whether a particular home plate umpire is calling for a star pitcher or a non-star pitcher. So my sort of first impression is that it shouldn't have particularly large results on this, or at least it shouldn't sort of significantly bias things. It might kind of make the estimation a little bit more imprecise. But yeah, that's definitely something that I'll have to think hard about. So thank you very much for those comments. Yeah, so let me get to the estimation results of this regression. So again, this past crew quality, that's like the first order effect. You know, how much is my call quality affected by who I worked with in the past? Again, this is all positive, with sort of a 1 standard deviation improvement in peer quality, leading to about 0.1 of a standard deviation of my own quality. This experience coefficient, across the board, more experienced umpires make better decisions. So that's kind of nice to know. The more time you spend in the league, the more the better you are at making those calls. And then this interaction term here on experience and past crew quality is negative, which again I think is kind of interesting. It's maybe you know, what we would have been able to predict. So this suggests that more experienced umpires have smaller peer effects. So essentially, when you're fresh and green and new in the league, it seems like people sort of absorb a lot of the stuff from their network. Then as people get more kind of settled into their ways, it's going to reduce the size of that peer effect. So I think that's quite an interesting finding.
Jed, I'm just going to interrupt you with Dennis.
Could you remind me how many observations you have in this set of regressions?
Sure. So this is at a game level. So there are about 29,000 games here.
Okay, I thought that was the case. It seems maybe this is a picayune kind of a point, but with 29,000 observations, to be thinking about things significant at the 10% level seems an incredibly weak read. You know, we usually have far fewer than that, and so I'm a little suspicious about drawing too much inference from some of these coefficients.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair claim, and that's something that I'll sort of I guess need to kind of think about. I think certainly I don't think that this, you know, is 100% concrete evidence, but I think that certainly it's sort of it's pointing at something interesting in a way that maybe it wouldn't be possible to do in other settings. So I think that's a very fair criticism. And yeah, no, I'll definitely take that criticism.
And then Jose's got a question for you.
Yeah, so how different are the results when you introduce the umpire fixed effects in this estimations, or is there one here?
Yeah, sure. So that's essentially comparing this panel, column 3 and column 4. So essentially I can control for own quality in one of two ways. I can either include lagged own quality, so how good was I last season, I can control for that, or I can include umpire fixed effects. So you can see including the past self quality in panel 3 or including the umpire fixed effects in panel 4 doesn't particularly change the results.
Okay, sorry, yeah, I missed this was the umpire fixed effects, sorry.
And then Gidon has a question as well.
Hi, Jed. Thank you for this. Quick question or two bits. Breaking the data down, do you also look at the umpire decisions based on ball strikes called for home and away teams, and also the time of the game? Do we see change over innings or score? For instance, if the game is a blowout, will the umpires be more likely to just try and end the game?
So I don't explicitly look for home and away. Again, because I'm sort of aggregating over entire games, and every home and away team gets 9 innings each. I would think that variation would be sort of able to kind of eliminate that. But I think, yeah, it'd be very interesting. So some stuff that I haven't included is thinking more about those game level effects. So exactly perhaps the time of the game, or thinking about the score of the game, whether it was a blowout or something like that. That could definitely be interesting to include as controls. Thank you. Yeah, that's a very good point. Okay, so in that case, I'll kind of progress on, and basically what I have for the next little while is kind of building some additional results on this. So the first result I have is thinking about how these pair effects might differ in terms of the number of games worked together. So most crews, even though they're sort of assigned to work with each individual umpire is assigned to work with a crew, usually for a series, sometimes for an entire season. Most crews don't work together for very long. So the mean in the data set is 7 games for a crew in a particular series. So the first thing I did was just kind of split the sample into crews that worked fewer than the mean and crews that worked more than the mean. And what I see here is that there are reasonably strong results in terms of the number of games worked together. So crews that don't work together very much don't really have particularly strong pair effects, whereas crews that do work together for 7 or more games in a particular season have a lot stronger pair effects. And again, this makes sense. Maybe if the spillovers that I'm thinking about come through in terms of analyzing games together, assisting each other after games during discussions and that sort of thing. It seems like maybe the longer that a crew works together, the more we would expect to see these pair effects coming through. So I think this is a useful sort of indication. I also have a chart here sort of thinking about how these effects might decay over time, or thinking about the persistence. So all of what I've been showing so far just looks at how my call quality today is affected by the crew that I worked with last season. But I can also kind of think back to the season before and the season before and so on, and see whether there's any persistence to this effect. And so what this chart here shows is the estimated beta 1 coefficient for 1 season ago, 2 seasons ago, 3 seasons ago, 4 seasons, 5 seasons ago. And what we see is that, certainly last season has an effect. 2 seasons ago maybe has a smaller effect. And then when you kind of get out to 3, 4, or 5 seasons ago, the effect is essentially 0. So I argue that there's maybe some persistence in effect with a fairly rapid decay. And then the next result I have is to think about the intensive margin. So if overall the results kind of suggest that working with good umpires improves call quality, I can start to think about how does working with a very good umpire affect call quality. So thinking about the intensive margin here. So what I do here is I'm thinking about splitting the sample up into quartiles. And so what I have is I run the same regression, but splitting the sample into quartiles based on the quality of crews last season. So the first coefficient here is the baseline coefficient. This was about that 0.1 standard deviation improvement. Then I think about what happens if I only restrict the sample to the crews last season that were in the first quartile of quality, then the bottom half, the top half, and the top quartile. And I think this intensive margin kind of suggests that the lower quality umpires, if I work with a low quality umpire season in the past, it doesn't really have much of an effect at all. It's if I start getting out into the good umpires and then the really good umpires, that we start seeing like a large peer effect. In particular, working with umpires in the top quartile of the umpire quality distribution last season, sort of, has a much larger increase maybe than even the baseline effect. So I think this is kind of interesting to think about how these results might look on the intensive margin. And then the last thing I'll do is just sort of briefly talk through one falsification exercise that I do. I have quite a few robustness checks in the paper, but I just want to focus on this one, which I think is quite interesting, which is thinking about next season's network instead of last season's network. And the reason I think about this is because it could be the case that what we're picking up is just mechanical. And in particular, if there's a tendency to have mean reversion, I'm bad one season, I tend to be better the next season, and so on. What we could have is some kind of artificial result showing up. So if I'm bad one season, and then because of that, I get assigned to work with maybe better umpires the following season, and then I sort of improve because of mean reversion, we might expect some kind of mechanical relationship between my quality and the quality of the crew that I work with next season. But of course, if this is a genuine peer effect, there's no way that the crew that I work with next season can have any effect on my quality this season, because I haven't worked with them yet. And so what I can do is I run all of the same regressions using next season's next season's crew quality as my sort of main explanatory variable, and I find absolutely no results. So there's no relationship between next season and the current season, which is kind of nice to know. So yeah, that is all I wanted to talk through in the main segment. If we've got another half hour or so, I'll just sort of briefly talk through another aspect of this data that I think is quite interesting, and then maybe we can open things up for more questions. But I think what I'm sort of next interested in, as well as this kind of first order effects, just is there a peer effect? I think the quality of the data that I have here can allow me to kind of think about how these decisions are made and how peers might affect my decision quality, in particular thinking about it through the lens of bias and precision. And so to motivate this, I have here pitch charts for 2 games in which both of the umpires got about 3/4 of the calls correct. So both of these are bad games, both of these are pretty bad, but you can see things look very, very different in these 2 games. So on the left, this umpire here, he had a pretty good idea of where the strike zone was, but then it looks like he just made really bad decisions. Some of these balls were miles away, and he called them strikes. Some of the pitches were sort of straight down the middle, and he called them balls. And so to me, this sort of is an imprecise game where this umpire had a very low precision. Whereas on the right-hand side, it seems like this umpire had an idea in his mind of where the strike zone was. It was different to the actual strike zone, but then he called the pitches extremely precisely with respect to the strike zone that he had in his mind. So you can kind of think, if we shift this strike zone down by maybe 6 inches, you'll end up with a very, very good game. So here on the right, I think that this umpire, his decisions were biased. So I'm thinking about the difference between precision and bias, and how peer effects might kind of manifest through these 2 channels. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to start thinking about like a decision-making framework, which is going to capture both bias and precision, and think about how peer effects might come through those 2 channels. In particular, because of the setting that I'm looking at, so these high stakes, rapid decisions involving judgment, the fact that I can see precisely what errors occurred allows me to think about this bias and imprecision. And then the framework that I'm kind of thinking about is this framework that's kind of been around for a little while, but was really popularized by this Green and Daniels working paper, which is that umpires are Bayesian decision makers. So they kind of argue that every pitch or every game allows the umpire to kind of improve his posterior of where the ball is relative to the strike zone, and sort of they show that they do this in a Bayesian fashion. And so what I'm kind of going to argue here is that with that kind of Bayesian framework in mind, biases kind of could reflect overly tight priors, maybe heuristics used to aid decision making, which is a sort of common viewpoint of Bayesian priors. And then precision might reflect knowledge or maybe even effort. So maybe if an umpire really pays attention, they can be more precise, whereas if they're paying less effort, they sort of are more imprecise. But there could be kind of knowledge effects as well. And I talk about this a little bit more in the paper, but I'm going to leave it at a high level here. And so what I can do with the data is I can study these peer spillovers along these two dimensions, so along the role of bias and precision. In order to do that, I have to quantify it. So again, I go to the data, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to think about how might we shift the strike zone in order to kind of minimize the associated errors. And then I'm going to think about the shift in the strike zone as being the bias, and then the post-shift errors as kind of the precision. So just to kind of give an example of that, here is a pitch chart. The black line shows the actual strike zone. So this is where the Major League Baseball defines the strike zone to be. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to think about moving the strike zone in order to minimize the number of incorrect calls. And I'm going to think that maybe that's going to reflect the strike zone that the umpire had in mind when they were making those decisions. The particular way that I'm doing it at the moment for my first order results is just moving the strike zone up and down, so only through the vertical plane. The reason why I do that is because the horizontal position and size of the strike zone is fixed. It's exactly determined by the position and width of home plate, which is identical in all ballparks and for all pitchers and batters, whereas the verticality is determined by the batter. So because the strike zone depends on physiometric things, so the stance, the height, and so on, I think maybe that the vertical aspect has more judgment. So I just move the optimal strike zone up and down. But I have done some stuff allowing it to move everywhere, and the results are quite similar. So essentially what I do, I take the strike zone, I put in these vertical bars showing the edge, and then what I do is I just basically move the strike zone up or down in order to maximize the number of correct decisions. And so in this particular case, it's the solid black box here. So the dashed black box is the actual MLB regulation strike zone. The solid box is the strike zone that minimizes the number of incorrect decisions. And so I'm going to think about this black box as being the optimal strike zone. And then I'm going to think about the distance that the strike zone had to be moved as being the bias, and then the quality of decisions associated with this optimal strike zone as being the precision. So just to kind of put this in terms that we've talked about before, the raw score for the game was about a 0.765. Initially, according to the true strike zone, the umpire got about 76.5% of the calls correct. If we shift the strike zone down by about half a foot, 0.469 of a foot, we minimize the errors, and under that optimal strike zone, 91.8% of the calls are correct. So I'm going to allocate this game a bias score of 0.469 and a precision score of 0.918. So I do this for every game, and then I want to think about, is there any peer effect in the bias, and is there any peer effect in the precision? And that'll allow me to kind of think about how these peer effects on decision making might spill over. So just to kind of show what I calculate, this is just a histogram of the biases. So I treat movements up and down symmetrically. So I just take the absolute value of how far it moved. Most of the biases are exactly 0, which is good. Most of the time the umpire is calling the game according to the actual Major League Baseball strike zone, but having sort of small shifts, maybe of just a few inches, is often enough to minimize that. So these are the estimated biases, and then this is sort of the precision calls, just a scatter plot of the raw score along the x-axis and the precision, so the corrected score along the y-axis. So basically, the further away a point is from the 45-degree line, the more biased they were, because that means that by changing the strike zone, we can get a very large improvement in the precision. So what I do, I calculate this bias, I calculate this precision for every game, and then I can just sort of run the same kinds of regressions that I've been running. So thinking about the average bias of the crew that I worked with in the past, how does that affect my bias in the current season, and the average precision of the crew that I worked with in the past, how does that affect my precision in the current season. So I run those regressions, and I'm sort of trying to think of how I should sort of interpret this. I find sort of small, for bias it's sort of marginally significant, but I find small effects in terms of bias, slightly larger effects in terms of precision. So to me, this is sort of some preliminary evidence of spillovers along both dimensions. So if I sort of think about bias as reflecting priors, precision maybe reflecting knowledge or effort, it seems like there are kind of good kind of mechanisms for spillovers along both dimensions. So I think with that I'll wrap up, and I'll jump to my conclusions. So just to sort of high level, the conclusions, I've sort of presented some empirical evidence of peer spillovers in decision making. The fact that the data are so great sort of allows me to identify some effects that it's just impossible to find elsewhere in the peer effects literature. So experience effects, time worked together effects, thinking about the intensive margin. And then because the data are so detailed, it allows us to kind of dig further into how these spillovers occur. So whether it's bias or precision or a bit of both. And where I'm sort of at the moment, I'm sort of thinking about how to model this decision making using just a simple sort of theoretical framework to show how these peer spillovers can give rise to different decisions. So yeah, thank you very much for all of your questions throughout. I really appreciate them all. I think they're very useful things to think about. And like I say, any feedback or questions are very, very much welcome. I'm happy to hear everything. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jed. I am going to ask a quick question, and then we've got a few minutes left for others if they want to ask questions. You may have covered this, but I'm quite intrigued about obviously this level of analysis of mistakes being made by umpires, because I'm aware that here in the UK, certainly in England, there's now quite a substantial degree of scrutiny that referees go under in football. So they have their decisions are recorded. They have someone watching them, and they'll review the whole game with them about which calls they got right, which calls they got wrong. They'll have scores of how well they did, and they'll go up to the next level based on whether they're a good referee or not, based on these decisions. Is there the same kind of scrutiny by the authorities in baseball?
So that's a very good question, and I think that there certainly is. There is a lot of scrutiny, but I don't think that a lot of it is official scrutiny. So I don't think a lot of it kind of comes from Major League Baseball themselves. It seems like Major League Baseball is kind of happy to, or is supportive of the umpires. And if the umpires kind of make mistakes, Major League Baseball, tends to side with the umpires. Where the scrutiny does come from, of course, is fans. So I've seen several Twitter accounts that every single game will publish like an umpire report card for that game. How many calls did they get correct? How many were wrong? How many runs did it cause each team? And of course, in situations where an umpire's incorrect decision leads to a team winning or losing a game, the scrutiny is quite intense. In terms of the official scrutiny, one thing that I will say is that it seems like there was quite a bit of resistance to introducing this ball tracking and this pitch effects data. It seems like there was a bit of kind of hesitancy on the part of Major League Baseball, partly because it would lead to exactly this kind of really intense scrutiny of the umpires. And in the end, it actually improved umpiring, so that's a good thing. Plus, it gives us a wealth of data. But one thing that Major League Baseball has kind of floated around is maybe doing away with umpires altogether. If you can precisely figure out whether a pitch is a strike or a ball, why do you need to pay a home plate umpire who might make decisions? But that's sort of very unpopular with a lot of baseball, old heads, because it's such a traditional game. It seems like some people are maybe willing to give umpires the benefit of the doubt just to kind of maintain that tradition, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jed. Peter put a comment in the chat a little while ago, and he's got his hand up. I'm going to invite him to go ahead and ask whatever he's got to ask.
I decided to hold off to the end because you're really interested about peer effects, but I was just thinking about extensions of your data. And to me, it seems like one thing you could look at is shirking, because sometimes calls don't matter. And I wrote it out in the thing. I'll just read it to you. First is, at many at-bats, the pitch doesn't matter as much as others. I suggest looking at calls that either result in a walk or a strike versus pitches that don't end the at-bat.
Yep.
And then the second is to look at playoff games versus regular season games to see if they get better. I know it's not what, but I just think you got that extra, you got the data, you might as well use it.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, I have been doing I've been thinking a little bit about the playoff picture. One thing that I'm kind of a little bit hesitant to do with that is that it's only a subset of umpires that are selected for playoff games, and I don't necessarily know how those decisions are made. It seems like Major League Baseball allocates playoff umpiring spots based on seniority, maybe on quality. I'm not entirely sure. So I think
actually just Googled that, and they said they don't do it by quality.
Oh, really? Okay, that's good.
But you need to dig a little deeper.
yeah. But oh, sorry.
No, but if it's seniority, that might be an issue.
Yeah. So that's one thing that I was kind of thinking about, is that it seems like it's a perhaps a selected subset in the postseason. But I think that definitely thinking about the how pivotal a call is. So if it's going to result in a walk or a strikeout, definitely you might have umpires kind of being more maybe they fall back more on their own choices, or maybe they kind of start to think more about what would my crew do in this kind of situation. The umpires as Bayesian decision makers paper I talked about, the Green and Daniels paper, they focus a lot on that, on how pivotal a call is, and they kind of use the pivotal nature of some calls to kind of inform their Bayesian decision making. So I definitely think that there's scope to do that. So I'll definitely look into that. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Next is Jose.
First, congrats for this fascinating talk. I think it was great. One is the first question is of curiosity. So, why don't they replace the umpire with kind of goal line technology? So, is it will it be possible?
Yeah, so it would be possible because, I mean, yeah, based on the data that I've used for this talk, you know, you could precisely say every call is a pitch or a ball. Every pitch is a strike or a ball with complete accuracy, or I guess the accuracy to within the technology. The reason why that hasn't happened is because of tradition, essentially. So, you know, baseball is a game that is just brimming with tradition. It's, you know, been around for hundreds of years, and so it seems like there's some hesitancy to do away with the umpires just because of the tradition, which, you know, I think is kind of a nice aspect of Major League Baseball. They're willing to tolerate some inaccuracy in order to kind of keep the traditions alive. But it'll be interesting to see what happens in the future if they decide to go down that route.
To replace manual robots. I also have a question about the PFX, because I think you touched on that, was this difference between bias and precision, but it was not very clear for me. What is exactly the mechanism? So what does represent those PFX? Is it like a transfer of knowledge? Is it like advices that they give to that they share? It's not clear. And the fact that the PFX is not persistent is also a bit puzzling, because you may think that, okay, they learn something and then they keep this learning for many years, and so is it that it's a kind of motivation and so it lasts short-lived?
Yeah. So I think the persistence is definitely something that I want to think about more, because, like you say, if you think about it as like a stock of quality that an umpire builds up over time, you might kind of think that the more time, you know, even past crews should sort of contribute to that stock, and so we should see like a longer sort of persistence. So I need to think more about why that's the case. The bias versus precision, I'm kind of thinking about those two things as representing, you know, different parts of decision making. So maybe bias reflects like a prior or a heuristic, maybe some kind of like rule of thumb. If you see the ball do this or do that, it tends to be a strike, whereas it does this, you know, it tends to be a ball. Maybe some heuristics around where exactly the strike zone is. And so I could definitely think about how an umpire, particularly a new umpire in Major League Baseball, might learn those kinds of heuristics and biases from the crew that they work with. The precision aspect, I'm still thinking about that, but I think maybe to some extent it could just reflect like effort. There are these papers that show that like effort is a one channel upon which peer effects kind of manifest. So it could be that, you know, paying attention for a 3.5 hour long baseball game is really difficult, and so, you know, people umpires have a tendency to kind of let their concentration lapse. I don't know if that's the case, but it could be the case that if there is that sort of effort aspect, and maybe being assigned to work with a crew who are very, very strict about paying attention all the time, maybe that sort of you know, applies here as well, and we kind of, you know, you have this flow over of effort, but again, I need to think about these mechanisms a bit more. So I appreciate the question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. And we've got time for one last question, which is Dennis.
Only one, huh? Because I've got a lot. The basic question that I wanted to ask is about the crews. So you said that the crew is going to be 4 umpires, and that that very rarely do they umpire together very many times as a crew of 4. What about overlap of say, 2 umpires as opposed to all 4 of them. And the reason I wonder about that is it that all 3 of the other umpires that have a peer effect on me, or is there maybe one particularly senior umpire or some umpire that has a strong personality, and that you could actually trace the influence of individual umpires across your data? And then the second question, this is a much quicker one, is in the old days, and I don't follow baseball like I used to, but in the old days, umpires in the National League and in the American League wore their protective gear in different places. In one league, they wore it on the outside. In the other league, they wore it on the inside. And in one league, they stood to the inside of the catcher, and in the other league, they stood to the outside of the catcher, or in different positions behind the catcher. And these are all things that you could capture, and I don't know if they still hold true or if they were just old wives' tales about having an impact, but it seems to me like things that in your data you could tease out.
Yeah, definitely. The second point, that's great. There's a lot of institutional knowledge about baseball that I'm still learning. So I'll definitely look into that, because I think, you know, it could be that some of these small differences are either kind of muddying the water and kind of giving me wider standard errors than I would expect, or, you know, hopefully not, but it could be sort of biasing the results. So I'll definitely look into some of those things. On your first point, thinking about like sub crews, that's a really good point. I hadn't thought about that at all. I've just been focusing on the entire crew that the umpire works with, so all 4 people. But I definitely think it would be possible to think about, you know, maybe like a subset of the crew, whether it's 1 other person or 2 other people or something, that kind of has the most leverage over the peer effect, and then trying to identify what the source of that leverage would be. I think that's a really, really interesting question, and it might give a bit more insight into the time worked. In particular, if you, like you say, if you kind of have, if I tend to work with 2 other people for the entire season, but then the 4th guy is just, you know, jumping in and out, it'll look like different 4-person crews, but in reality it might actually be, you know, the fact that I'm being influenced by these 2 really heavily, and then the 4th guy is sort of providing less insight. So yeah, it's a really good point. I'll look into that a lot more.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jed. Thank you, everyone, for contributions to a fantastic discussion. A really interesting paper. Obviously interesting given the discussion it's generated, and even from a baseball outsider like myself, I can see the fascination and the utility of the data set. So thank you very much, Jed. Thank you, everybody. We will meet again this time next week, and this time next week we'll have Johan Rowelak of Aston Business School, and his talk is on some positive economic benefits from hosting sporting mega events, bucking the trend. So again, promises to be a good presentation for discussion. Thank you again, everybody. I wish you all a fantastic weekend. I look forward to seeing you again this time next week.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.